Okay, so starting the social foraging section. We'll talk about exploitation in this lecture, and then in the Thursday lecture, cooperation in competition. And then we'll move on from there out of foraging finally. But wanted to create a special, just because we didn't really talk much about social foraging in chapter 9. There's a lot of cool stuff that happens in social foraging, so I wanted to kind of create a separate unit for that. But I still don't have the UCE for Unit F out still. It's just was a long week last week, and I apologize for that. I will make it up to you. Either, I'm likely at this point going to release the unit, but because it's late, then I'm probably just going to increase the drop policy. So it'll be available for those who want to practice it, but those who say, hey, that's too late, I need to rather work on these other UCEs, then it's just, another free drop. So that's probably what I'm going to do then. Now that I've got F behind me, and I think I have the plan done for Thursday and G, I'll finish that F UCE and then also finish this G UCE, and then we'll should be back on track then. Otherwise, this week, your submission of selected organism due Friday. This is preliminary. You can change the selection. I'm not grading it for oh, I think that's a bad choice. You don't get your points. Anyone who gets sort of an earnest attempt at this, your group's going to get the points. It's just an opportunity for me to read through that and then say, well, yeah, I think this is a great choice of organism, but maybe your selected context is a little too broad. Can you make it a little more specific? Because you want to kind of imagine how to build an experiment for that. I see the question. I'll get to in just a second. And when you eventually do think about the experiment, you can kind of imagine, what if I could build a really crazy experiment that there's no way that I could possibly implement just by going out to, Home Depot and buying things. But that's okay. So you could imagine a very sophisticated, because you're pitching it to someone who has money, who has resources, and so that's why you can kind of think like I really, I noticed there's this weird, that these animals in the city tend to aggregate in some places than others, and I don't know why. Or maybe I do know why, but I don't know how they're detecting that. Or maybe the reason they're aggregating there is because something that they're used to sensing in nature is they get a bad signal, bad information in the urban environment, and so that's why they go there, so on and so forth. And so you could imagine that lots of different experiments that you might not feel like you could ever have the resources for, but you could still have the opportunity to pitch it because you're asking somebody else to supply the resources for then you to go and do the experiment. So you won't do the experiment in this class. But just keeping that in mind, I want it to be sort of very open-ended. So it's better to kind of be simple, but also specific. So try to pick, something that is easy and concise to explain, but also you, you don't want to just be broad, and you want it to be compelling and interesting. You don't want it to be sort of obvious. If you propose something that it seems like, well, we kind of already know that, or it can't really be any other way, then that's not really a compelling proposal for further research. But if you spot like, oh, that's weird, I don't understand why these lizards are always doing this whenever they're in this context, and that whenever they're in that context, that's like a great thing. Like, I don't know. So I'm going to test whether it has something to do with heat or something has to do with water. And so those are my two hypotheses, that this difference is due to heat or water. And so I'm then going to build an experiment which will differentiate between heat and water. That'll be my proposal. And that maybe explains why these critters do something different here than over here. So that's what you kind of keep in mind for this. Don't stress too much about it. Can be short, and if you submit it and it really looks like you put thought into it, you're going to get the credit for it, and then I'll give you feedback and we can go back and forth if the feedback I give you doesn't make sense. Question? That's right. That's what I covered that before. That is, again, I know that it's not out. When I get it out, I will add another drop so that you have an opportunity to complete it if you want practice on Unit F. But if you don't want practice on unit F, I don't want you to feel like I've piled up two UCEs together. So then you have an opportunity to just skip it and you still get your additional drops. And so right now, UCEs are, you drop the lowest 5 will be dropped. So just for this semester, because I'm late on getting the UCEs out, I'll make that lowest 6 dropped just for this semester because the F will be coming out so late. Yep. No, you're not going to lose points because it's too broad. You're not if you submit something that is in earnest that you said, I really think I'm trying to like if my feedback is it's too broad, I'm not gonna take off points for being too broad. I'm going to just give you the feedback that for your final project, I'd like you to try to find something that is a little narrower scoped. And I think we've got I forget how many groups we have, something like 25 or, you know, I don't know, something on the order of 25 to 30 groups in the class. So each group is submitting a paragraph or two. It shouldn't take me that long to read through and provide feedback, but it is going to take me a little bit of time, and I'm not going to start until after the deadline. So give me a few days, but hopefully I'll get that feedback back to you, and I'll just do my best. Yep. No, no, yeah, we're using is because everybody's been put into a Canvas group. When you submit it, it will then show up as a submission for everybody. So only one submission per group is necessary. Other questions? Okay, great. So let's then talk about social foraging. So this is the ARE that I assigned for this group, so the perusal reading. I don't particularly like this paper. I don't think it's well written. I am sort of upset at how little they cited. I'm surprised it got into current biology. It is not a current biology quality paper, but it has interesting data, which is probably why it got into current biology. And so like a lot of the things that they think are an enigma, I think most people who study social foraging for a living would say, duh. Uh, but they might be, I don't know these authors. They, I guess, might be interlopers or new people coming into the field. I don't know. It's not a great paper, but it's an interesting. It's interesting that it talks about this. It is sort of this phenomenon of how do you explain density when animals forage together. These bats forage in very large clusters together, and that's what they're trying to explain. And that is definitely a worthwhile thing to study. And they studied it with some very sophisticated technologies to be able to track these bats and try to explain based on their density what kind of patterns they get. And so you'll read if you read the perusal assignment, you'll see more details about that. But one of the kind of key findings that they have here is that if you kind of build a model of trying to explain density versus so this is sort of a fitness proxy for why would you forage in these densities. And their proxy here is the time to first prey detection. So the idea here is if you were to forage alone, then how long would it take you to find your first prey and you go out on a flight? And then if you were to join a group based on the density of that group, then does that improve your ability to find prey? And what they find is that what's consistent with some of the patterns that they see is that there's kind of this eavesdropping effect. Remember, bats have this cool auto communication, this where they can echolocate. So they emit a signal, it reflects off of a prey item, and then that gives them some idea of based on how it hits their ears, then they can triangulate and figure out where that prey item came back from. So that ends up being public information. It was meant for the bat that emitted the ping, but that response to the ping can be heard by other bats. So conceivably, you can kind of parasitize the information that is coming back that was emitted by another bat, but is now coming off of that prey. And so the suggestion here is that one of the reasons why you would forage in these large groups is you actually benefit not only from your sonar, but from the sonar of other bats in your group. So, that's kind of cool. But once you get to kind of a critical density, eventually your own sonar is just hitting the back of other bats, and bats are kind of getting in your way. So there's this sort of interference effect. And so as a consequence, there's this kind of intermediate density that suggests that that's kind of the best density that you would expect to see in nature, according to sort of these authors here. That Now they didn't say that that this is a model that helped to explain the large densities that they were seeing in these groups. And they said, well, these large densities, like we actually, because we don't know the right parameters, we don't know exactly where this kind of knee in the graph is. But the point is that there is some sort of non-trivial group size that would be kind of balances these two things. And this idea of balance in social, like we've talked about balance in the solitary sense, is between gains now and opportunity cost lost. Well, in the social sense, we often see a similar balance between the gains of joining a group and the costs of joining a group. And so that's what we're seeing here, is that the gains of joining are strongest here. The losses of joining are strongest here. And so there's this sort of optimal point here where if you can get into a group that's of this size or of some intermediate size, then you're going to find prey much more quickly. It's like a distributed sensor network. Yeah. The eavesdropping is why you would join a group. You want to hear the signals of the other bats and eavesdrop on the responses. But then once it gets really dense, then if you join that group of bats, then there's always going to be a bat in front of you. It's just going to be really hard to see where the prey is. So at some point, these large clusters are not so great. So I think the authors sort of suggest that, that this knee suggest, like the large densities that you see in nature are explained by this knee in the graph, that bats are sort of foraging in an optimal way where you're optimizing the group returns. But to a behavioral ecologist, whenever somebody says optimizing the group returns, what? Like that doesn't make a lot of sense, because where would be the feedback path? How do you how do benefits to the group come back to the individual if it's a bunch of unrelated individuals? And so I want you to think about that when you're reading that paper. And and then if you think deeply about it, and how do I have any sustainability majors in here? Okay, so a couple. So in like every sustainability class you talk about, what's like the worst collective action problem that comes up over and over again? Yeah, oh yeah. So more generally, what is a problem with fisheries? That's what I'm looking for. Tragedy of the commons. Does it come up a lot in your classes? Right. Tragedy of the commons comes up a lot when you talk about sustainability. If we take a tragedy of the commons perspective, um, would we expect to see groups of bats at this size or some other size? What size? If we think about this from the perspective of what is the best thing for the individual to do, would we expect that densities would stabilize here or somewhere else? Somebody have any thoughts about that? So if there's a group out there that is doing this well, this group is just plowing by. It's like hitting all sorts of insects. These bats are just doing great. Wouldn't you like to join that group? You'd like to be a part of that foraging force. So you join that group, and what happens to the density? It gets higher. You've joined the group, and you've now made the group returns less because you're now starting to crowd that group out. But it's still a lot better than foraging alone. So as you're now in this bigger group and you're feeling pretty good about your decision, someone else joins that group and you're like, get out of here, man. That bat now is doing much better than it was doing alone, but it's now made it harder on you. And this keeps going and going and going. And what happens? What group sizes do we end up getting? Any guesses? Like, where would this stabilize, this process? At what point yeah. Yeah, so this is normalized. So one is the time to first prey detection when you're by yourself. And so that's way over here. So that's like a really big group size. And that is the prediction from Tragedy of the Commons. That's the problem with highways at rush hour, is that you want to get home quickly, so you join the highway, and it's much quicker than the side streets. But if there's so many people needing to get home, what do? They also join the highway. As they join the highway, the congestion slows the highway down. At some point, the highway is just as bad as the side streets, and then you flip a coin and say, well, it's rush hour, so I may as well take the side streets. So you've now ruined the resource because everyone individually was making a good choice to use a resource that's better than the alternative. But because everyone's doing that and there's no control of access to the resource and the resource is depletable, then the resource becomes just as good as the alternative and you lose the benefit. And we see the same thing happening in animal groups. So this is the example. So if you take a course like, for example, SOS 325, which is, I think, economics of sustainability, then you'll see an example like this. So this is the fisheries example where, so this has to do with the returns you get as boats enter a fishery. And so you have this problem that if any boat can enter a fishery, then as boats enter a fishery, the population dynamics of the fish are such that they start regenerating faster because you start eating the fish and taking them away from their carrying capacity. So they're able to regenerate faster. So you get this rapid regeneration rate with a high number of boats, and you get sort of this optimal number of boats of, say, 4 boats in the fishery. At that point, then you get the biggest difference between the fish you're getting out and the cost you're putting in to putting those boats out there. But yeah, go ahead. Pardon me? No, I was going to keep, but if you have a question, how would more, sorry? Yeah, with no boats in a fishery, you assume that the fishery's reached carrying capacity, which means that the number of fish has stabilized at some high population. And so at that point, the net reproductive rate in fish is 0. So if you eat one fish, then you don't, there's very few fish have an opportunity to reproduce because they can't find food. Or if they do reproduce, their offspring die quickly because they're near carrying capacity. So one of the interesting things about fisheries is that as you eat or as you fish more in the fishery, you pull the population away from carrying capacity, and that gives offspring more ability to survive, and you get a higher reproduction rate. So up to some so-called maximum sustainable yield, you actually get more production out of a fishery the more you fish out of it. So ideally, you would fish to some intermediate level that produces a lot of fish out of the fishery, and then this intermediate level, if you balance out the costs it takes to actually put boats out on the fishery, says that maybe 4 boats, that's the optimal amount of boats you have on the fishery. But if you've got 4 boats on the fishery and every boat is getting this yield, getting this number of fish out there, if anybody can join the fishery, then somebody else is going to say, all right, you know what? That's a lot better than I'm getting on my own. So I'm going to join this highly productive fishery. And it's highly productive because there's other boats that are on there. And they are going to do better than they did on their own. But the difference between the costs and benefits gets smaller and smaller and smaller until what we predict is even though the socially efficient way to exploit this fishery is 4 boats, what we end up getting is that there are 8 boats end up stabilizing on the fishery. Why 8 and not 9? Because at 9, it's actually worse to join the fishery than to do anything else. So at that point, you actually pay more of a cost. So that is, the tragedy of the commons in fisheries is that it's a depletable resource that is not that you can't. It's not excludable and it's rivalrous. It's a depletable resource that you can't keep anyone out of. And so as a consequence, you end up getting stable population sizes where the resource that was so attractive to bring individuals in ends up not having any more benefit than the background resource rate. So it's this unfortunate, every individual is joining because it's better to join, but then that ends up equilibrating where the population in the resource has depleted the per capita benefit to the point where you may as well not join. And that's what prevents people. That's why it equilibrates. That's why people stop joining. So when you don't have control of entry, you have this problem. And we see this, this was a well-known problem in economics. For a long time in social foraging, people were confused about this too. So there was, you get plots like this, where you have group size here and you do some calculations and you figure out what the fitness is. And so you've got, well, here's an individual forager. They're getting, I'm going to call a normalized fitness of 1. So this is how many offspring you can produce if you forage alone. And then you go to 2 individuals in the group, and there's some benefits to having 2 individuals in the group. And so the fitness goes up, and then 3 individuals, and that's when you get to this G star, where that maximizes the fitness to every individual in the group. And so people are saying, well, shouldn't we expect to see groups of G star size out of nature? And what people would find is usually the group sizes were much larger than G star. And people realized once they started doing a little bit of more math and measuring things, that actually what was happening is that you were seeing that that you were getting individuals that kept joining for the reasons that was just mentioned back there, is that because even though it's not optimal to be at 4, 5, 6 individuals in this group, it's better than going alone. So you end up equilibrating at these large group sizes, which I'm calling here G hat. So you end up finding that in nature, you find that you get groups that are between G star and G hat. And what's the X factor? What's the difference here? The groups that are closer to G star are ones where the first individual that can get in, or the first set of individuals that can get in, end up preventing others from coming in. So they're able to monopolize the resource. They have strong resource holding potential. And so they can manage the G star. In the fisheries case, if you own the fishery, you tend to not overfish it. That's the exact same thing that's happening here. But if it's relatively free for individuals to join, then you find that it goes to G hat. You pretty much never see groups larger than G hat, because in that case, it's better to just go alone. So, this is, the majority of group sizes you see in social foraging are between those 2 numbers. And it comes down to, again, like an animal version of the tragedy of the commons. All right, but it gets more complicated than that. So any questions about that so far? Yep. Yeah, like if you go out and you say, I'm going to go to the Isle Royale in Michigan and see how many wolves are in a pack, then you're gonna get a number. I'm going to go to see how many bats are in a cluster. I'm going to get a number. And if you are able to model, and this is not easy to do, but if you were able to sort of go in and see how much, and I'll show you how you can actually get empirical data on how to generate this. But if you're able to generate this blue curve, then what you'll find is that the group sizes that you find in nature will be between this max and this kind of, equal to individual. So you get these 2 sort of stable group sizes, one that's in here and then individual foragers over here. Yeah, that's a great question. So it's sort of the fitness is at its high. So if you could manage to keep, if this is saying, like, let's go to the bat example. This is saying that, like, with the eavesdropping, 3 bats in the group is perfect. Like there's no interference, and we all can share each other's sonar, and it's great. But the trouble is, as you're flying through the air, you can't keep another bat out. And so there's another jerk individual comes and becomes your 4th. You try to fly away from them, but they just keep coming near you. So now you're stuck with 4 individuals. So even though your 3 got together and said, let's join up the 3 of us so that we can get these benefits together, because you can't keep out anyone else, because you've now created a social resource that others can exploit, then they are free to come in. And as they borrow from the resource that you built, they make the resource worse. And then it keeps going. And that's why it settles out over here, because at this point, your social resource is just as broke as doing it alone. So nobody wants to join that. Yeah. Yeah, they're trying to. That's a great question. So we'll adjust competition on Thursday. I wouldn't call this necessarily competition. That's what I'm calling this exploitation. So there is a positive externality using kind of economic terms that's generated by these foragers foraging together. So a bat sends out, sonar, and that creates public information for others that can benefit from. And but due to interference effects of having to be close together, then that is depletable public information. So it creates this trade-off. Yeah. Well, I would say that the splitting up you tend to see, that's a great question. So if they're unrelated animals, then I mean, you'd see a bunch of groups that are all at this size. Once you get to sort of related animals, then there are other mechanisms on which selection can act that can kind of keep count of how well things are doing and split things up. So um, there, I mean, this is sort of a little bit of a stretch, but like for example, there are ant colonies like we have in the lab that certain times of year, if it gets too dense in their nests, they'll split into two nests. And then other times of year they come back together. So the ecological factors are affecting this sort of fitness here. And because they're all of these related sisters, then there are mechanisms that have evolved that have tried to tune their density to sort of be best for their subnest. But if it's like a bunch of unrelated bats, then there's there needs to be a way to sort of form a coalition. Like in human systems, we do split up to try to maintain this, but we do that with contracts and other things. But then we have to somehow find a way to monopolize and keep others out. So if like 10 of us got together and we realized like we really need to be several groups of three and two, then we could all agree on that. But then that agreement helps sort of ensure that we're kept, out. And so we've got this agreement that sort of provides a wall that prevents us from wandering into it. But then we also have to keep others from coming in. So in the end, so that's why we call these resources open access resources or common pool resources, because the key feature of these resources is they're depletable, they're rivalrous, and they're non-excludable. And those two things together, those are the key points which sets up this dynamic. So once you have the ability to keep things out, then it's a different problem. But usually the way you solve this problem is figuring out a way to keep others out. And that works in animals just as well as human systems. All right, so any more questions about this graph and how this becomes kind of stable? All right, so that might explain why you would see very large densities of bats that might actually be larger than their model predicts by that minimum there, because there is no mechanism unless those bats are highly related and have a way to sort of sense their density and then use that as a cue for how they need to reorganize to split up. If they're just unrelated bats, then individually it's going to be better for them to join and join and join until they're at very large group sizes where the interference basically washes out the end of the benefit that brought them all there to begin with. Sort of that's again the tragedy of the commons. Now, things do get weird. There are some examples of animals that do not seem to fit the rule that I just said. And wolf packs are one of them. Wolf packs, a lot of people talk about the examples of, social foraging, all these crazy things that these wolves do or whatever. But when you actually end up testing it, you don't actually need a lot of wolves in a pack to be efficient. And it doesn't make sense why packs are as large as they are. So there was this paper that was done here. The Tom Waite is actually one of my old mentors here, and so it's I really like this paper. So what they did in this group is, so this is real data across Isle Royale up in Michigan. And so this is gross per capita rate of prey capture by different packs. And these are pack sizes down here. So this is an example where you just go and you observe how big is that pack, how big is that, and then you just watch them for many, many days, and you see how much prey did each pack take down, and you generate a plot like this. This plot, notice like this is saying here that this is for packs of one, of size one, that's one wolf alone. And this is, so this little peak up here is, you know, of two wolves, and this is three wolves down here. So this is the best fit line for this. And what this tells us is that G star and G hat are right next to each other. So the best thing you can do is to be a pack of two, but you're always going to get a straggler wolf of three. You know, that's what we would predict just by looking at G star and G hat. But we would expect to see wolf packs between 2 and 3, because 2 is best and 3 is sort of the kind of the tragedy of the commons. It's kind of the equilibrium, because you know, once you get to 3, it drops below how well you could do with 1. So why join a group if you can do just as well alone? So we'd expect maybe packs to be 2 or 3. But you get giant packs, way bigger than this. And these packs are doing way worse than they would if they were doing alone. That is the mystery that people have tried to solve. And so in this paper, they go through and they test all sorts of different hypotheses, and none of them work out. So it's kind of like that, the paper we had with the luring, with the burrowing owls. Like they tested a bunch of hypotheses and knocked a bunch out, and then, you know, found ones that were supported there. And what they ended up finding is that if you look at use risk-sensitive foraging theory, so what we talked about in last unit, then what you find here is that so scavenging birds seem to be seem to help predict these sizes that are seen in nature. So what they're saying here is there's a bunch of ravens. In some areas, there are more ravens than others. And these ravens, whether you're foraging on a rabbit, whether you're foraging on a deer, whether you're foraging on a large moose. Now you might say a large moose, don't you need a lot of wolves to take down a large moose? Turns out one wolf, most of the time when they took down like these giant moose on Isle Royale, one wolf would chase it down, grab its neck, and just hold on to its neck, and the wolf would, or the moose would shake it, and the would bang the wolf against trees. The wolf would break all sorts of ribs, but ultimately would take that prey down. And one wolf could do that. The other wolves would just stand and watch. And for some reason, which we're getting into, that wolf that paid the huge cost to take down that moose didn't seem to want to monopolize that prey. It did not try to chase off those other wolves. It sort of allowed them to share in that capture. And but what they also observe is that ravens also scavenge on these big takedowns. And they're very efficient at scavenging on this. They can greatly reduce the amount of moose left over for the wolf if one wolf takes down one of these moose. And it uses up so much energy to take down a moose that the amount of energy lost to the ravens actually gets very close to the survival threshold. So remember that survival threshold I was talking about with the junco, that if it doesn't get enough food, it won't survive the night. In this case, it's not the night, but it won't survive maybe the month. Is that the amount of food scavenged by ravens is enough to push the intake rate of energy very close to the metabolic costs of just being a wolf. And so it seems like scavenger birds are a huge liability. And so what they've got here is they said, well, let's model the probability of an energetic shortfall. So the probability that the amount of energy you take in is not enough for the amount of energy you have to spend to take in that energy. And they said we can model you know, pack sizes, how much energy is coming in and what that effect is. And what they've got here is these white bars are, hypothetically speaking, if ravens were not scavenging. The hashed bars hatched bars here are 2 kilograms a day lost to scavengers. And the dark bars are 10 kilograms a day lost to scavengers. And what you find is the white bars have a minimum at a pack size of about 2. So the way you minimize your probability of shortfall when there's no scavenger birds is you go around with a pack of 2. But as you add in, so remember the hatched bars are moderate scavenging, the dark bars are a lot of scavenging, and even moderate scavenging, then you get packs of 10 to 18, will end up minimizing the probability of shortfall. So that's what you're supposed to look at here is these black bars are high and then they dip low, or these hatched bars are high, then they dip low. So the dipping low, that's where these stars come in. That's the optimal pack size for that condense. And then the white bars kind of dip this way. So you can see that there's this intermediate pack size of 2. So if we just look at risk-sensitive foraging theory, it suggests that it's actually a way to minimize your risk of shortfall to work in these really large packs, because these large packs help to fend off these scavenger birds that are going to try to steal. And they also modeled the intake rate. So this is not risk, this is back to rate maximization, which is the majority of last unit. And up here, these are going to be, and I'll explain the lines here in a second. This is for moose, and this is for deer. And so these different lines correspond to different assumed loss to scavengers. So this triangle is no scavengers. The purple line without a symbol is a lot of loss to scavengers. And what you see, the triangle here is a pack size of 1 is pretty high. You go to 2, and then it drops down. And so here you'd expect 2 to be the optimal prey size or optimal pack size, and then 3 is where it drops below. So you wouldn't expect to see a whole lot of packs greater than 3. But if you go to this down here, that's where you get scavenger birds 20 grams a day loss from theirs. And there it's like it gets better and better and better to be in a larger pack. And for intermediate scavenging levels, this is just flat. So there's really not a lot of pressure for one pack size here. Just due to these scavenger birds, it kind of flattens out all the costs and benefits. And it's just, the losses you get from living in a pack of wolves are balanced out by the benefits you get by them scaring off these carrion birds. So now, and that's for the moose though, because given how much energy it takes to take down a moose, a deer's an easy kill. And so in the deer case here, notice all of these have the same shape. And what do we see in nature? In areas where wolves are primarily foraging on deer, they're in packs of 2, maybe 3. And areas where wolves are foraging on large moose, they're in giant packs. And yet, only one wolf is taking down that moose at a time. So those giant packs are not there because the moose is big. Those giant packs are there because it takes so much energy to take down the moose that the carrion birds, the scavengers, are such a huge liability that you need a team of wolves to guard against the ravens, basically. So that's what you get out of it is, if you're foraging in for big prey, you're never going to do that alone as a wolf. Thus quoth the raven, nevermore. So with that in mind, questions? Yeah. Right. Sure. Yeah. So these right now are going into a model. Um, in the paper, and you can read this paper if you click on this link in the slides. You can go to this paper. They do have some estimates for where this lives for realistic numbers for these, and they've chosen a range of these realistic numbers. So what they're saying here is that some parts of the island you're going to get more scavenging than others. And so it's hard to sort of say, and the number of ravens is going to be a big part of it. And so, and also the time of year and all sorts of other things like that. But what they're saying here is that if you happen to be in an area where there's no scavenging, then we would expect something a little more like what's on top here. If you're an area with lots of scavenging, they think this is a realistic amount, that lots of scavenging could be 20 kilograms a day, and that could be down here. So they're saying that across a habitat where you don't know exactly what the scavenging load is going to be, then we'd expect the model predictions that are in this range. And they're saying for this whole range, then you get basically no, a pretty much flat fitness function across these group sizes, which might explain why, if you look on Isle Royale, that you get a huge variation. So if I go back, remember the pattern they're trying to explain is this. So there's just huge variations. And as far as we know, there's no reason why wolf packs should be greater than 2, maybe 3 wolves. And yet we very frequently see 18 wolf packs, 12 wolf packs, 10 wolf packs, and so on. So they're saying, what could explain this variation? Well, there is variation in scavenging on the island. And due to even a little bit of scavenging, there's not a lot of cost to having a wolf pack of size 13 versus a wolf pack of size 6. So that's why you just see you're sort of the selective pressure when they're scavengers, the selective pressure on optimal group size is weakened. So we would not expect to see one group size pop up. But on deer, for example, an area, times where they're only foraging on deer, then the energy needed to forage on the deer is not, even with scavengers, that in that case, you would really expect to see there's a huge benefit to working in packs of 2. Here, because the moose uses up so much energy, then you may as well be anywhere between 4 and 18. It doesn't really matter, and that might explain why you have this huge variation on the island. So, any other questions? Oh, yeah, one more. With on which on this slide? Okay. Yeah, well, I think this model is so. I mean, so this is notice this says net rate of intake. So I think in this model, they're modeling the it's in terms of kilograms per day because they wanted to use that unit, but in the end, energy is the currency, which I think is being modeled here, which is, I think, where they get that negative. And so I think they're saying that if there are, or to put it another way, if you forage alone, this is what this purple line down here means. If you forage alone, because this model doesn't have it doesn't have like a conservation of mass, it's saying that if you're getting 20 kilograms per day taken away from a raven, you're only going to end up actually your gross revenue is going to be 17 kilograms. So you made 17, but then you lost 20. And that's where this negative came into play here. In a more realistic model, it wouldn't be possible for the ravens to scrounge for more or to scavenge for more. So then all of these would be clipped at 0. But I think to simplify the model, then they just said, we're just going to model that as to keep this as a nice constant 20. Then what we're saying here is that a single predator can't get 20 grams a day. Does that make sense? All right. Any other questions about these examples in group size and the interesting consequences of interspecies interactions? Okay. All right. So that kind of brings up okay, that's great. That's group size. And in that case, we had one producer, one wolf taking down the moose, but then a bunch of others that were just hanging out, waiting for, food to fall in their laps. So how do you decide if you're the producer or the scrounger? Is kind of the question here. And so there is another really nice model system for that, these nutmeg manakins, spice finches. And so this is a common bird used in these social foraging examples. You can bring in the lab, put in groups, and you put down different experiments and watch how they forage together in these different experiments. So this is some examples I'm taking from Giraldo and Du Bois, but Lucas and Giraldo now he's off in kind of the corporate world, but was sort of a big name in social foraging. Giraldo and Carrico, and had a huge set of really cool papers about birds like these and social foraging things that they did. And so this is sort of one example of that. So here's a video of one of these experiments where you put them on a grid like this. There's these tiny little cups, and some of these cups have seeds in them, other ones do not. And if you watch these birds, there's some birds that are walking around looking for cups to stick their little beaks in. And there's other birds that don't seem to be doing that, but instead seem to be following other birds around. So this is kind of going back to that. I had that California quail video that I showed, and there was a male and a female, and after a point, it looked like the female would go down and peck, and then the male would peck in the same spot. There's some of that going on here. So if you look at these videos, and you can then use sophisticated video techniques to track the angle of the head of these two different of the birds, and you can see how often do their heads up or down. And so there are certain birds that I'm going to call producers that the angle of their head tends to be sloping down. And there are other birds I'm going to call scroungers that the angle of their head tends to be sloping up. And what they found in these, by doing this video analysis, is if you have your head down, the more hops with your head down, the more patches with seeds in them you find. So it does seem to be that in order for you to find patches, you need to be looking down, which kind of makes sense. So they're sort of estimating the visual field of these birds. And so birds that look down and hop around tend to, the more you look down, the more patches you find. But then on the flip side of that, the birds that have their head up, there's another consistent pattern that they found, is that when the heads are up, then the more time you spend with your head up, then the more patches you join after another bird has found seeds there. So basically, you've got two strategies here. This bird is looking for patches that have seeds in them. This bird is looking for birds that have found patches that have seeds in them. And then we'll go and run over to this bird and then try to then take part in whatever cache of seeds has been found. So we're going to call those producers on top and scroungers on the bottom. So any questions about that so far? And this is a common term we use in these exploitative social foraging cases, is that you'll have a set of individuals that are actually actively foraging and another set of individuals that are observing the individuals that are foraging, producers and scroungers. Okay, so, there is eavesdropping effectively at play here, right? So it's not quite the echolocation, but when you put your head down and you see something and then you move towards it, that's public information. So if you're, really don't want someone to scrounge, then you got to somehow conceal the fact that you just found food. And it's very hard to conceal that fact, just like when bat sonar, when you send that ping out, that response can be heard by anybody. So it's a kind of a type of eavesdropping that we're dealing with here. It's a similar sort of exploitation. So not a lot of math here, but we have to model this in some way. And so what they do is they say, let's figure out how many producers and scroungers we might expect to find in our little habitat. So what they did is they built this little model, and the details here, again, are not super important, but the idea here is that there is the producers. They basically find patches with so this lambda is how often you find a patch if you're walking around at a certain speed. And this capital T, well, if you multiply how often you find patches by the length of the experiment, then this will be how many patches you find. And so again, I'm not asking you to memorize all of this. I just want you to see how we predict the split between producers and scroungers. So that's why I'm walking you through it this time. I'm not going to ask you to memorize this formula or the variables in this formula, but it would be great if you could parse this formula if you saw it again. But that's not the key takeaway here. But we just, in order to get there, we got to go through this. So this is the number of items that the producer has found. And then, but how much does the producer, the intake rate for the producer, how much does it actually get to eat? Well, for every item it finds, it gets a little finder's advantage. This is the amount of seeds it can get before anybody swoops in. That's the so-called finder's advantage. And then this up here, well, this is if F is the number of seeds in the patch, F minus A is the number of seeds left over when finally those scroungers run in and try to eat from that patch. And so you take the remaining portion that you did not get to monopolize, and you have to divide it up between you and if G is the group size, the number of birds that I put in my experiment, and if P is the proportion that are playing producer, so P is a fraction, that's like if 100% are producer, then there's no scroungers. If 100% are scroungers, there's no producers. Then 1 minus P times G, that's the number of scroungers that come a-running in order to split up the rest of the patch that I have found. And so this is how much you get. It's how much you get before the scroungers arrive, and then imagine it's divided equally up among you and all the scroungers that arrive. That's how much you get of everything that you find. So that's the producer's intake rate. Likewise, we can then do the scrounger's intake rate. And so we can say that for the scroungers, then there is a certain number of scroungers, and they basically, it's everything that's here, but it's without the finder's advantage. So this is sort of like all of the food patches that are found, like P times G. That is the number of producers in the environment. So the producers in the environment are finding patches. The scroungers are not. The scroungers are finding producers. So they don't get the finder's advantage, but they get to split up whatever's left after the finder's advantage has been removed. And so that's where we get the scrounger intake rate. So the question is, if we have these two intake rates, this is how much you make as a scrounger, this is how much you make as a producer, then what's the optimal balance? What's the proportion of producers that we'd expect in this environment? So any questions about this? We just need this math in order to answer the next question to give us an idea of what is generating these mixtures. Okay, so I can take those things and plot them. And so I can plot the payoff to the scrounger, that's this thing here, and I can then plot the payoff to the producer, that's this light colored one here. And just to make things hard, I'm going to do proportion scrounger instead of proportion producer. That's why it's 1 minus P on this axis here. And what this shows me is that basically this is saying that if there are no scroungers, then the only way to find food is to become a producer. So there will then be a benefit to start turning your head down and looking for food. So we're going to see a growth in the number of actually I got those backwards. So if the number, production, again, I said to make this hard, 1 minus P. I'm using the same graphs that they used in the original paper. So reverse what I just said there. If there are no scroungers, everybody's a producer. If everybody's a producer, you're probably not finding that much food because all the other producers are finding food. It's actually better for you to lift your head up and look for the other producers. And that's what we see here, is that here the scroungers get a better payoff than the producers. So the number of scroungers, the number of birds with their head up starts growing. On the flip side of that, over here where there's a lot of scroungers, at this point, everybody's got their head up, nobody's got their head down. So no food is being generated for the group. At that point, you have no choice but to start looking for food yourself because it's just not paying off to look at the other birds. So then you get producer growth. So it starts moving this way. So in the previous case, it basically, you imagine it starts here and starts moving to the right. In this case, it might start here and move to the left. And so you end up getting this optimal case in the middle that is our so-called stable equilibrium frequency. This is the equilibrium level of producers that we would expect in any group. So what fraction of the group? Well, it depends on the amount of food that is in each patch, the finder's advantage, and the total group size. If I know those three things in an experiment, I should be able to predict how many birds have their head down and how many birds have their head up, if this theory is right. That's the crazy thing here. That's what I should be able to do. Question is if it works. But before we get to the if it works part, are there any questions about this? So I'm not going to ask you to, but if you just set this thing equal to this thing and solve for P, that's how you get this. Okay. So we're going to refer to this as a BSS, a behaviorally stable strategy. If, we might later on talk about evolutionary stable strategies. Certainly in other classes, you probably heard about ESSs. The difference between an ESS and a BSS is that an ESS sort of plays out over evolutionary timescales. So it's how many of each do you have in a population, and that might change over generational time, and then you get a balance, and that is an evolutionary stable strategy. Here, this is a behaviorally stable strategy, which means it is a balance that can change during the life history of the animal. Thus, BSS, behavior is modifying it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so these are in this experiment that they do, they're all spice finches, they're all nutmeg manakins. And so they're all the same species, they forage on the same things, they compete for the same things. So yeah, now if they were, different, then you could be scrounging for food items that the producers don't care about, or you could be producing food items the scroungers don't care about. It gets more complicated. Right. No, here, this would really be like in the wolves. How do you decide if you're the wolf taking down the moose or the wolf waiting for the moose to be taken down? Hmm. Any other questions about this? Okay. So, does the behavioral strategy, stable strategy, does the BSS work? So here's this cute, there are a bunch of interesting experiments that have been done about this. I picked one, but there are different experiments that test it in different ways, and they have similar results. So, but I thought this was a clever experiment. So the idea here is that you put all these birds in an arena where it's got all these little perches with these barriers. And for each one of these perches with these barriers, then the birds can go over the barrier. The only way they can produce is by going on the producer side with the perch, getting on the perch, and basically using a string to pull open that string to get access to the food. So, but then so if you're on the side without the perches, you have visual access to all of those on the side with the perches. So due to the sort of geometry of how everything works out, you can actually separate producers and scroungers because choosing a behavior is actually directly correlated with choosing a side in this experiment. If you are going to look, if you're going to scrounge, you go to the side where you can see everybody. If you're going to produce, you go to the side where you can get access to these little perches. So that's nice because then you don't have to constantly be analyzing the head up and down because that could be changing dynamically. So that's the basic experiment. Everybody have any questions about that experiment? You just manage to separate the behaviors. You can only produce on this side. You can only scrounge on this side. So then you just keep track of where the birds are. Are they on the producer side or the scrounger side? And then, so what do you get? So these are three separate runs of this experiment, three separate groups of birds. And initially, in each of these three runs, they configure the device for a BSS of one scrounger. So remember that P star, you can configure that. I know how many birds are in my group. I know the F, the number of seeds that are in the patch. I know how many seeds a bird gets before other birds can come over. So I can estimate what the the BSS would predict. And in this case, they configure the box so that it only has one scrounger. And initially they put the birds in, and these 6 birds end up, assorting themselves so that there's 1 on the producer side and 5 on the scrounger side. That's cool, sure. Then they switch it right in the middle of the experiment. So then they reconfigure the device right in the middle of the experiment so that you now have a BSS that's between 2 and 3. And right after they switch it, they didn't move the birds or anything, then the birds reallocate themselves so that you now start getting a BSS that is closer to the prediction of the 2 to 3 foragers from the prediction there. So it is very clear that apparently the producers and the scroungers are both very sensitive to their intake rate and are choosing a strategy in much the same way you might choose a patch. In fact, you can use the marginal value theorem as a mechanism to explain how you might do this. So there is a long-term rate of rewards from the environment, and you can choose whether you want to be in the producer patch or the scrounger patch and how long you want to be in each patch. And so the MVT can actually end up predicting this sort of result as well. So it's pretty strong, it's pretty robust. And crazy, was there questions about this? Yeah, I'll go here first. That's a great question. Is there a way to sort of, predict how often you switch? I mean, yes, but that I think would be modeling a different, like in this case, we're just modeling the demographics of who's where. But then the switching, then you'd have to sort of think about, are there switching costs? And so then you could say, I like to model, like that is a fair question to ask. But then that would then be asking about a different sort of response. You get the model in a different way, set up a different experiment. And then you could say, okay, so it costs so much to switch. And so if I can increase the cost to switch, how does that change the allocation or how often you switch? And people have done that type of experiment to say, it's a little bit like if I put patches farther away from each other, how often do they switch or stay in the patch? That's, a similar sort of thing. So this experiment doesn't address that, but you could address that. Ah, so in this experiment here, you can, and I don't recall off the top of my head, it's been a while since I've read this paper, but I think you can very quickly, like I think they have access to the bottom, change, for example, the number of seeds that are in here. So like you can just quickly drop out, this. So these went from having like 8 seeds to having 5 seeds. So at that point, the finder's advantage stays the same, but the big F, then the rest of the seeds there changes. And so that's like a quick thing you can do to change that. Other questions about this result? Yeah. Well, oh, so that's a great question too. I mean, this is certainly unnatural, like stand on a perch, pull on a string. Before even doing this, and this is like when you do animal behavior experiments, all the stuff you learn this semester, you got to compress into these things. They had to train the birds to be able to know that they could get seeds this way, to land on a patch. That was operant conditioning. So they had to do the training first. After they did all the training, so all of these birds had been trained to be able to produce. So they all know how to produce. So then now that we have 6 birds that know that this is how they can get seeds, then when do they decide when to get seeds or when to watch for other birds getting seeds? Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, so it'd be on average. So if you're on the producer side, um, then it's the number of seeds that you can manage to get access to before the scroungers um, can run over. So it's going to be an average. So you could say on it, we do a pilot experiment and we put 6 birds in here and we wait until a bird pulls this, and then we count up how many seeds does that bird get. Right, right. So it has sort of this quick access, like, aha, I'll go over here, and then but then once it jumps over, then all of the scroungers are like, oh, and then they come over, and so it might get one seed, two seed, three seeds. So that's yeah. Mhm. Other questions? Okay, so it has this nice repeatable result. What's also kind of cool about it is you can take six birds, put them in this experiment, and see who's producer and who's scrounger. And some birds will pretty much always play producer, and some birds will pretty much always play scrounger. So not only are these BSS like proportions correct, but it actually sorts birds into some birds are producer, some birds are scrounger. What's the difference? What's the symmetry breaking that's happening? It might be that just some birds are a little better at finding the food, and some birds are a little better at finding other birds. And so it just ends up having this sort of, I don't want to call it a division of labor, but it ends up being sort of a matching that those birds that are better producers tend to be producers, those birds are better scroungers, tend to be scroungers. But here's the crazy, and so you can put six birds, see who's a producer and scrounger. You put them in a cage, and then 6 months later, you take those same six birds out, put them in an experiment, see who's producer and scrounger. You get the same producers, the same scroungers. Maybe that's not that surprising. What's interesting, though, is that if you then take one of those birds, so bird number six, you just swap in a new bird, also a spice finch, nutmeg mannequin, put it in the experiment, the whole mixture changes. So it's like this who's the producer, who's the proportions stay the same, but who's the producer and who's the scrounger is an emergent property of who what individuals are there. This is very much like a model of like, you've got group work or whatever, and you're like, you notice whenever I put these four people together, these are the leaders and these are the followers or whatever. But I noticed that if I swap one person out, then suddenly like the leaders stop talking, and then suddenly certain followers become leaders. It's the same sort of thing here. So there's all sorts of interesting kind of emergent social dynamics that you can kind of study here to figure out what's going on. So I just think that's really cool. And they have done this experiment multiple times. And so yeah, that's it. So yeah, questions about producer scrounger exploitation. Okay. So again, I'm working on UCEF. I will make it up to you. I'll add another drop and UCG group project stuff. Let's do this Friday. And with that, let's give you some credit for being here. All right, there it goes. So question is, in in the initialism BSS, what is the second S? It's behaviorally stable. What's the second S? So what word is in BSS? That's all I'm looking for, and that's all I've got for you. So we'll talk about competition and cooperation on Thursday. Hi.